We're going to finish our discussion of the Iliad by a close examination of Book 24. As we have seen, Hector is dead. Achilles has shown no reverence for his body and is dragging him around the walls of the city. Now, the lack of burial in Greek culture would have been highly problematic, more so than even modern day culture. The Greeks believed that if you did not have a proper burial of the body, the soul could not go on to Hades. All souls went on to Hades, as we'll get to see in the Odyssey and as well in the Aeneid. Hades was one giant underworld. It was where everybody went, regardless of how you acted in your life. It was the destination after this life. And Patroclus even approaches Achilles and says, the same thing you're doing to Hector is what you're doing to me. You didn't bury me either. Now, Patroclus's body had been preserved in some ways by the gods because Achilles wasn't observing the rites for his friend by burying his friend. He did tell Patroclus, I will hold a big burial for you. I will hold funeral games, etc., which he does after I have the head of Hector. After he has the head of Hector, he still doesn't really follow through until Patroclus intervenes and visits him and says, please bury me. And he has this elaborate funeral for him, which is actually kind of barbaric. It continues to show Achilles' bloodlust. He has Trojan boys burned on the pyre with Patroclus. He seems unsatisfied by the death of Hector. It doesn't seem to help with the mourning of his friend. It doesn't seem to solve his perennial problem, which has been his wrath because he is angry over his own mortality. He's angry over his own fatalness, his inability to recognize any value in Kleos. What is Kleos to Achilles, who will be dead and unable to hear about it? Why should he care the stories that are going to be told? And so Achilles is asking questions that are enduring for all of us, and he doesn't seem to find any answers, and hence his anger. So he's in the middle of a war that he can't get out of, that he's lost his best friend in, and he doesn't know even what it's for. The end of the book is a beautiful scene of reconciliation between Priam, who we really haven't had a lot of encounter with. The most beautiful moment that we've seen Priam, the first time we're introduced to him, is in book 3, when we go behind the walls of Troy, and Priam is an old man who asks Helen, please come over, let's look over the side of the wall and look at those who used to be your kinsmen, and you tell me who everybody is, right? And so Priam has been observing everything from the walls, watching all of his sons die, and now watching his greatest and last son die and be dragged behind the chariot. So Priam has been primarily an observer through this whole thing, and now Priam becomes the ultimate actor. And Priam will go to visit Achilles, and we will get to see their correspondence with one another, their conversation, and this moment of reconciliation that provides for hope that maybe there is reconciliation possible for all of the people involved in this war. I say hope because those listening would have also known that despite this moment of reconciliation, Priam will die, and die in a very horrible way, being killed by Achilles' son. The walls of Troy will actually fall, and we have to keep that in mind, that even though there's some hope here, and even though we end with a lament over Hector, that it was not the ultimate end of the Trojan War. In the same way that we began in media res, we will also end in media res. So let's end in the media res, let's end in the middle of things, but let's end with this hope, even though we know that that's not the end of this story. The final book of the Iliad begins with Priam asking Achilles for Hector's body. He has been told, guaranteed by the gods, that if he goes before Achilles, that Achilles will grant him his request. So he's assured of this, and even though Hecate does not believe the god's promise and she begs her husband to stay home, he goes anyways to Achilles. He feels the assurances of the gods and goes there. Achilles has also been told that he is to return the body back to Priam, and that this is Zeus's will. So before they even meet, Achilles knows this is Zeus's will and has agreed to it, though not rather wholeheartedly. And Priam knows that this is the God's will and that they are giving him assurance as he approaches the slaughterer of his sons. The request begins very similar to how Phoenix and Odysseus began their request to Achilles. Both of them called on Peleus. Both of them reminded Achilles who he was, which is the first line of the book tells you, the son of Peleus. Priam says, remember your father, godlike Achilles. Now, why this memory of a father? Odysseus and Phoenix were trying to call upon some authority, some remembrance of the land of their fathers, some loyalty to the Greek people, that they were all from that land of their fathers, that was all connected. Here we have a different resonance with your father. Remember your father who is like me. I'm like your father. I am fated utterly since I sired the best sons in broad Troy, but not one of them is left. His second call is revere the gods, Achilles, and have pity on me. We've heard something similar again from Odysseus and from Hector. Have pity. In the sense of Odysseus, have pity on all the Achaeans that you doomed to death by refusing to fight and by asking Thetis, your mother, to intervene and make sure that a lot of the Achaeans died. Now, Odysseus didn't know that, but he was watching all of his fellow Greeks die and lose because Achilles was sitting on the sidelines, and he begged him, have pity on those of us who are fighting in this fight. Later, Hector said, have pity upon me and give my body back to my father. And now Priam is asking, have pity upon me and revere the gods. Remembering your father, for I am yet more pitiful, and endured these things as no mortal man upon the earth. And then this is the moment of pathos, of a call to action, of a moment in which he overcomes Achilles' hard heart, Achilles' inhumanity. He draws to his lips the hands of the man who killed my son. He is not here manipulating Achilles. He is repeating things that Achilles has heard before, but no other person in the Iliad has dreamed of doing something like this. In another text, it says the man slaughtering hands, right? That this is a man that everyone knows as raging, wrathful, furious, possessed by the spirit of Ares, violent, inhuman, like a lion. And yet, Priam is able to return Achilles' humanity to him by treating him as a father would treat him. Peleus has been gone the entire time, and now we have the spirit of Peleus returning, a father kissing the hands of his son and begging him to remember his father. It's a beautiful poem that I want to read, 20th century poem by Ruth Padel called Ceasefire, which draws on this moment and I think shows us how this moment is resonant, not just in the time period in which it was sung, but resonant even now. Put in mind of his own father and moved to tears, Achilles took him by the hand and pushed the old king gently away. But Priam curled up at his feet and wept with him until their sadness filled the building. Taking Hector's corpse into his own hands, Achilles made sure it was washed, and for the old king's sake, laid out in uniform, ready for Priam to carry, wrapped like a present, home to Troy at daybreak. When they had eaten together, it pleased them both to stare at each other's beauty as lovers might. Achilles built like a god, Priam good-looking still and full of conversation, who earlier had sighed. I get down on my knees and do what must be done, and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son. When Priam speaks, Homer tells us that he stirs inside Achilles a yearning to weep for his own father. He pushes the old man away, but gently, and the two of them together, they weep, and they weep so loudly that everyone can hear them weep, that their cries are heard throughout the hall. Here, Priam is weeping for Hector as he lays at Achilles' feet. And Achilles is weeping not only for Patroclus, but for his own father, who he will never see again. In some ways, this reminds us of the tears of Thetis as she cried over Achilles, knowing that Achilles will die. Achilles reveres this old man for coming before him. What bravery is shown here, what humility is shown here by Priam. And this virtue in Priam reminds Achilles of what it means to be a human being. Now, they are still on opposing sides. There still is tension. Achilles tells him, provoke me no further. There is the sense that at any moment, Achilles could still become the wrathful Achilles that we know. His entire character hasn't changed, but his heart has been softened. There is the potential for reconciliation here, and he at least gives way to the old man's request. Priam is advised not to stay at the side of Achilles, even though Achilles asks him if he wants to stay the night, invites him to stay and be a host to his guest. Priam is told by Hermes that this is not a safe idea and that he better take the body and go ahead and go back to his side of the wall. We know, again, as I've said, that the war is not going to end here, that we still have the Trojan horse coming, we still have the destruction of the city. We still have actually the enslavement of Andromache, the death of Styanax. We have the rape of Cassandra. We have Helen, who will have to return home with Menelaus after 7 years of wandering. There's lots to happen after this moment that the audience would have been familiar with. So Homer could have ended anywhere, just as he could have begun his poem anywhere. And yet he chooses to end here. He chooses to end in this beautiful scene of reconciliation between Priam and Achilles. And it's the last time that we saw Achilles. Achilles opening himself up to Priam, agreeing to this request, washing the body so that the old man will not see how he disfigured it. And also playing host, being a person again, willing to be in a community again, even with an enemy. And this is a hopeful scene for Achilles' character. Priam returns to the city, and we end with Hector's funeral. Now, for a Greek poem, this might seem strange or odd, and it should. If a poem is going to be written by an American about the great deeds of the Revolution, it would be very strange if we ended with a beautiful scene of the funeral of a British soldier. So what is happening here if we are celebrating the death of the enemy? Why is Homer doing this? And what does this have to teach us about human nature, about war, both sides, its futility, the lack of needful deaths, the reverence that should be shown those who have died in sacrificial ways? What all is here? And I think that there's lots of questions to be discussed, but not necessarily answered. We end with the voices of the women in Troy, whereas majority of this tale has been about men and about their exploits in battle. Even Athena has dressed up as a man, probably more often than she's appeared as a woman in this text. Here we have the women's speech ending the story. Cassandra calls out, "Look upon Hector, men and women of Troy. Come, if ever before you used to rejoice when he returned alive, since he was the great joy of the city and all its people." And everyone is seized with grief, and it's uncontrollable grief. We have Andromache. We get to hear her words as she sees her husband return. Hecuba, as her son returns, she cries out. And even Helen's final words, laments over the loss of Hector. So the final words still given to a Greek, but a Greek who's on the side of the Trojans at this point. And then the last words of the entire epic are, they tended the funeral of Hector, breaker of horses. In some sense, a funeral is a celebration of the life of that person. We have the celebration of his kleos. We get to see Hector's kleos ending the poem. Whereas the poem began with the wrath of Achilles, we don't end with the wrath of Achilles. We end with the wrath of Achilles being satisfied and with hope being given for Achilles' character, that he will no longer incur this wrath, that he will no longer be infuriated against people, that he will no longer let his wrath make him inhuman and isolated. Instead, he reconciles, he opens himself up, as we've said before. And the ending scene is funeral for Hector, the uplifting of his fame and his glory and his honor, even after his death. It ends with a dead body, but it ends with a lot of hope for the kleos, for these glorious deeds of these human beings who strove to fight and live and who died.